Hello, Chris. Nice to see you today. I thought we'd start by declaring our star signs. I am a Libra. Hi, my name's Heidi. I'm 27. Nice to meet you.
I am an Aries, and I'm not going to tell you how old I am because it's a very big number. It's my birthday very soon.
The reason why I wanted to have you on today, Chris, is because I wanted to have a good piece of content of how people examine astrological beliefs and kind of melt that in with how people use that to influence their love lives and whatnot, because I feel like star signs and horoscopes, people directly align those together. So first of all, what got you interested in being a student to this type of psychology?
I used to be a believer, so certainly kind of growing up as a kid, I was terrified of ghosts. I was very into UFOs, etc., etc. And I can remember back in the 1970s, long before your time, when Uri Geller appeared on the scene. He was probably one of the world's most famous and controversial psychics, or at least he claimed to have psychic power. And I remember I was in the sixth form at school. I was dead excited when he appeared. Anyway, I kind of maintained that belief, or those beliefs, I should say, right through doing a psychology degree. It was when I was doing my PhD at Leicester University, which was in a completely different and much more respectable area, that somebody recommended a particular book called Parapsychology, Science or Magic. It was by a guy called James Alcock, a social psychologist from Canada. And I loved the book, and B, it was the first skeptical treatment of all this stuff that I'd come across. And I found it fascinating. I kind of completely switched from being a believer to being a skeptic at that point. So I maintained my interest in the weird stuff, including belief in astrology, but more from the point of view of what's the psychology behind it. If it's not true, and I'm afraid with astrology, we can be very sure that astrology doesn't work in the sense that astrologers can't really do what they think they can do. But clearly so many people do believe in it, absolutely passionately. And so there's something there to be explained. So, I think we can learn something about the human mind by studying those kind of phenomena.
I want to start, before we get into the whole kind of investigation of star signs, astrology, and how they pair with people's love lives, into the more kind of general idea of belief, because that's what it is at its core. It's the ability to believe. I'm going to open with something you wrote for the Metro, and the listeners can listen to this at home. We'll link the article in the bio. There are many psychological factors that play a role in examining such belief. These include our desire to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves, our urge to gain a sense of control in an unpredictable world, and our tendency to take note of evidence that apparently supports our beliefs, but to ignore any evidence that contradicts them as well. Whether it's religion, paranormal activity, or even Father Christmas, it shows me that it's a very human thing to believe. It's almost like it's meant to be there. But why are so many people connected to this selective belief rather than always the tangible evidence?
And the thing is, our brains have evolved in such a way that we have various cognitive biases. And they've evolved in order to basically keep us alive for long enough to pass on our genes to the next generation, not to help us to apprehend the truth with a capital T. And a lot of these cognitive biases are relevant to kind of belief in astrology. One example would be the fact that we are really, really good at spotting patterns and making connections between things and seeing links. And it's a really important skill. It's the basis of scientific progress. It obviously, back in the day, it would help our ancestors to stay alive by being able to plot the change in the seasons and to look out for predators and to catch prey and so on and so forth, all of those things. But we sometimes overplay it. And so we think we are seeing meaning in what is essentially randomness, and we make connections that aren't actually really there. Now, why would we do that? Well, usually it makes more sense to come to a quick decision that's usually right, depending on what's sometimes called system one thinking. You might, for a shorthand, to think intuition. Sometimes there are lots of situations where you make a very, very quick decision, and usually your intuition guides you okay, but sometimes it can lead you astray. But if we rely on that rather than the slower, but probably more likely to be right, rational reasoning, then we're more likely to stay alive in terms of the kind of the conditions of our ancestors, where there were predators around, there were all kinds of dangers and so on. So, and I say our brains are very similar to those of our ancestors. We haven't changed that much. And these kinds of cognitive biases that were all really about kind of, threat detection and spotting patterns and keeping us alive, they're still with us today. And I suppose the big cognitive bias, the one that's the most pervasive of all, and I think is particularly relevant to astrology, is confirmation bias. We spot evidence that supports either what we already believe or what we would like to be true. And we either fail to spot or think we have good reason to ignore or not take into account any evidence that goes against those beliefs. And we all do it. I mean, it's not just believers, skeptics do it as well. It's as well to at least be aware of it so you can try to guard against it. But it's part of being human. All of these cognitive biases are just part of being human.
Dialing it back to intuition, what gives someone a natural higher propensity to have more efficient intuition? Is it something that you can measure, or is it just one of those things that we don't really have an answer for?
There has been quite a lot of psychological research trying to investigate intuition. And as with many things like this, the picture is complex, So we can be fairly sure that sometimes it does make sense to go with your intuition. But in other circumstances, it most definitely doesn't. And what we don't have is a kind of a cookbook that says, this is when you should trust your intuition and this is when you shouldn't. We can point to certain situations where when people depend on their intuition, it's not a good idea. I suppose a good example there would be, we're still very, very fond of interviewing people for jobs. And yet all the research shows that actually doing it that way does not lead to the best decision making in terms of getting the best candidate. We know that, but we still carry on doing it because we just can't get rid of the thought that no, I can judge people. I can decide, who would make a good candidate for this post, And there are other situations where, as I say, we know that depending upon that kind of intuitive judgment just isn't good. A lot of medical decision making relies on people depend too much on what they see as their intuition or their clinical experience, where in a lot of those situations, and there are exceptions obviously to all of this, but in a lot of those situations, actually just letting a machine make the decision gives a better outcome. But we don't like that. We like to feel that no, we're good at making these judgments, And again, we all have that bias.
It kind of goes into that technical thing when trying to find the right person for the job of, are we technically going about this to find the best algorithmic person for the job, or are we looking for someone who's more of a culture hire or a personal fit? And I guess like logic people would use the different systems to do that. So blind tests for technical, interviews with different people for a cultural fit. But what you just said there reminds me that people are creatures of habits and they like to do the same thing, and sometimes disrupting that is, a little bit of a difficult thing for them. But also it kind of feeds into the Barnum effect, which I was very interested when I was reading through the article. Basically, that's how we're going to segue into the horoscopes. It's this generalization and critique. Well, it critiques the generalization that when you get told something very close up, for example, if I said, Chris, you're so insightful, but then when you zoom out, of course you're insightful. It's so obvious. But maybe you can give a better description of what the Barnum effect is and how it's used in, horoscopes and astrology.
Now, the Barnum effect it doesn't apply just with respect to astrology. It applies not only to kind of all types of divination, where you apparently can tell complete strangers all about them. You seem to know stuff. It also applies with respect to any kind of personality tests within psychology. You have to be aware of the existence of the Barnum effect. And what the Barnum effect is that there are certain kinds of statements that sound as if they're saying something very insightful about your innermost personality, and particularly when you're on the receiving end of them. But the point is that actually these statements apply to pretty much everybody. So a typical Barnum reading would include things like, if I was doing a Barnum reading on you now, I might say things like, I'm getting that you've got a lot of unused potential. You've achieved quite a lot in life, but there's so much more if you could just tap into that potential. And of course, we all feel, yes, that's me. I'm getting that you've got a better than average sense of humour. Well, of course you have, because if other people don't laugh at what you laugh at, they're the ones with the dodgy sense of humour, aren't they? Your sense of humour is the right one, isn't it? Obviously. And I'm picking up now very strongly that there have been times in the past when you've regretted revealing too much of yourself to other people. And we all think of those times when we've said something to somebody, talked about something quite intimate and then later wish we hadn't, and then you can go on like that. I mean, I could go on for half an hour with those kind of statements, There is a lot more to the overall a set of techniques called cold reading, which can be used by deliberate con artists to convince complete strangers that they know all about them. And obviously, if you want to set yourself up as a fake psychic, they are really useful skills to have. Now, I don't believe that most people who believe they've got psychic powers are deliberate con artists. I think they genuinely do believe that they've got this gift. And the same goes for astrologers, tarot card readers, the lot. Yeah, these people believe in this stuff, and that in a way is it makes it even more effective, But I think that a lot of the time they're using a kind of form of cold reading with all the reliance on the Barnum type statements. I mean, one good way to do this, it's very obvious and everybody's thought of doing it, is just to read out the horoscopes in a magazine or a newspaper to somebody, but without telling them which sign you are reading. And you'll find that a lot of the statements there, probably most of them, you think, yeah, that does apply to me, And I mean, this is something I do just kind of routinely now. If I'm hearing somebody who's having a reading, I kind of clock how many of the things that are said also apply to me. And that gives you some indication of, well, do they apply to everybody? That's what the Barnum effect is. But if you believe that this is very specifically being tailored for you, so I'm going to show this in studies. If you say we've drawn up a horoscope based on the birth details, and it's just basically based on your star sign, well, that's a 12th of the population. Okay, it's a kind of big proportion of the population. Then people won't give it such a high accuracy rating as if you say it's on your specific birthday. And if you include it, the more specific you make it, the more impact it has. The more people feel it's accurate.
So the Barnum effect and subjective validation goes hand in hand, because people believe what they want to hear, because it's always easier to take in the positive, affirming information that people are getting from the horoscope, from religion, from cults, or I don't know, which, does demonstrate that it is part of what is meant to be inside of a human to kind of make them believe in the next thing that might kind of not be true or might be true, but might make them take a step in the right direction. It's the same thing that you would tell a child or a toddler of you can do something, and they might not be able to do something, but it encourages them to improve the process and go further and go forward, which is all really fascinating stuff. Something that I've been wondering though, especially that you work in the field and you're constantly engaging with these different pockets of people who are in precarious, ideologies and beliefs. Have you had many encounters with what you can conclude from astrologists as a whole? Is their personality or characteristics, or is there a common through line?
One of the interesting kind of psychological factors here is something that we call locus of control. And the idea is that we're all somewhere on a continuum from having either an internal locus of control. People with an internal locus of control, by and large, believe that their lives are the way they are because of decisions they've made and their own behaviour, their own actions, and so on. Someone with an external locus of control sees themselves as being kind of at the mercy of external forces. Now, that might be, governments or all sorts of other things, but it also includes the idea of kind of supernatural forces, cosmic forces. And not surprisingly, people who believe in astrology are more likely to have an external locus of control. They see themselves as being more the kind of the victims of circumstances. And part of the reason for the attraction of astrology is it's an attempt to kind of regain some control. If you can, through astrology, kind of get a glimpse into the future, or you can figure out what another person is likely to be like, it might at least give you the illusion of control. And that can be psychologically helpful for people to cope, especially when they're feeling that their lives are out of control and so on. Now, astrologers themselves are more likely to have a bit more of an internal locus of control, because they do feel that they are in control of this system that they understand, and they can kind of use their expertise. So as I say, most astrologers do genuinely believe in what they are doing. I've known a couple of people in my life who started off as complete believers in astrology, but also understood the scientific method, and basically decided they wanted to use the scientific method to prove the validity of astrology. And after trying quite hard for quite a long time, became complete skeptics. They realised actually, astrology doesn't work in the sense of having any true validity in that sense. And so then they kind of, in one case, that person went off and became a clinical psychologist, just kind of dropped his interest in astrology. The other is a guy called Jeffrey Dean, who is like I'd say the number one expert in the entire world on empirical tests of astrology. And I kind of quite surprising that he's still fascinated with astrology, even though he doesn't believe in it at all. Well, he's on top of every single study that's ever been done. There's a big free download for anybody that's interested. So I think it's over 1,000 pages thick. It's free, called Understanding Astrology. And it's Jeffrey Dean and three other collaborators that have put this massive work together, which will tell you everything you ever want to know about empirical tests of astrology, and probably a lot of stuff you didn't want to know. But as I say, he's still absolutely fascinated with this stuff. But for most people who are into astrology, they're not particularly into the scientific method. They've got an attitude of scientific method is too crude to test, what we know. And you think, well, hang on, if you're selling these services to people, then it ought to be testable. It should be testable. And the fact that it isn't is just that, they come up with some very kind of dubious lines of argument to justify that. But they'll come across enough confirmatory evidence for them to maintain their belief. And they've got enough excuses to explain away any kind of things that don't appear to. But as I say, the general kind of appeal for people who make use of astrology is it's an attempt to try and get some kind of control, get some kind of understanding. For some people, it just actually provides a framework to think about things. I know at least one or two people who are counsellors who use astrology without actually believing in it, just as a way of kind of saying, well, according to astrology, this is the sort of person. You think you are that kind of person? Let's talk about that, Again, that's absolutely fine. People can believe in whatever they want to, as far as I'm concerned, if it doesn't have negative impact on anybody else. But in terms of that basic question of, well, whether does it actually work from a scientific point of view? I'm afraid the answer is definitely no. But it's still interesting in terms of, well, what are people getting out of it psychologically then?
I think one of the things people psychologically get out of it is they get to escape the nihilism of there's not much else apart from you're born, you die, and in between you might get to live a bit of life. The older I get, the harder I find it to be agnostic. I like trying to keep a little bit of hope in that sense, because I just like to always be open to ideas. But as I get older and life takes its toll and reality goes on, I just find it more helpful to live in the present day and appreciate the time you have in this world. And I find it actually quite difficult to cope when people think that there's something better after you die. I think that's a waste of a life in a way. But I do understand why these little bits of hope, whether they're through star signs or, I don't know, like a zodiac sign, how they kind of give people a bit of light and fun in their life, you know. So maybe they're not completely bad, like they occupy people in some kind of way.
I think that's right. I think, you know, we would. I mean, skeptics sometimes have a tendency to just paint all of these beliefs as being bad things, and 9 times out of 10, that's hardly ever the full story. There are positive aspects, as you say. You know, that sense of feeling that they're connected to something greater than themselves. Community. You know. Yeah, well, not just the community, but that is important. I mean, there's the community of, you know, fellow believers. So obviously you've got all kinds of internet groups, you've got conferences, you've got events that people can go to, or just going to see your astrologer, you know. I mean, at the end of the day, if your astrologer is actually giving you good advice on how to cope with problems in your life, well, that's probably a good thing, isn't it? I mean, they may be giving you rubbish advice, so you need to be careful. And of course, people can get hooked onto services that they have to pay for. It can run up huge debts. So there are real risks as well. But it's getting that balance between realising that it's not necessarily all bad. I mean, there's a lot of really great artwork related to astrology. There's that whole side of things. And so, of course, it's part of a general New Age philosophy for most people, that there's a whole host of other beliefs that go with it, often a rejection of science. Obviously, I'm a big fan of science myself, but, you know, not everybody is. There's that kind of whole there's, you know, more to life than you understand, you scientists. Well, maybe, but I don't think so. But I could be wrong, you know. And there's a lot of positive stuff there as well. I remember going to doing a presentation at a one-day event at Conway Hall in London. I'd got wind of because Conway Hall is like the home of rationalism. You know, Bertrand Russell lectured there, and you know, skeptics have their meetings there. I've done loads of talks there for different groups. I got wind of the fact that they were having a whole day event on astrology and other forms of divination. I thought, this seems a bit out of character. So I got in touch with the guy who's organising it, who's a friend of mine, and I said, look, if you're doing this, you've got to have at least one person who's actually going to stand up and talk about the scientific attempts to test astrology, which is bad news for astrology, obviously. And so I ended up doing it. And I was the only person on the bill who was a skeptic. And of course, the crowd really didn't want to hear that. It was kind of quite fun. They were, you know, but clearly they're not remotely interested in empirical tests of astrology, unless on the odd occasion where the results seem to support astrology, and then they get very excited. Then suddenly, actually, it's okay to test things scientifically, and then we realise what was wrong with the study and why they thought they'd got a significant result, but they hadn't really. But it really is not about kind of trying to test these ideas. It's just about using those beliefs in their lives in a very practical way, and they find it helpful, they find it useful. So
I guess the skeptics where you and I will have the issue is when people's kind of private beliefs like start to integrate into how we like run a country, or how we look at reality, and how we deal with matters of science and health and facts, you know. I can't remember. Is it like Jehovah's that don't do blood transfusions?
Jehovah's amongst others, yeah.
I feel like my line is quite clear of why I'm on that side, but I'm quite curious as someone who is so into your, you know, skepticism and how you came to that realization of, you know, what is really important to you to, you know, keep true and kind of keep people grounded away from losing themselves into, you know, non-secularism and belief and various things like that.
I mean, I'm a big supporter of the kind of, you know, Humanist UK, and yes, well, good for you, because it's and I just kind of the general philosophy there is actually a kind of very tolerant philosophy. You know, it's not kind of it's not one that is kind of saying, you know, we should ban all kinds of religious beliefs and practices and so on. It's actually very tolerant of all these other religions, but it's saying you don't get special treatment because of your religious beliefs. Everybody should be treated equally. And if, as you say, you start imposing your religious beliefs on other people in a way that's harmful to them, then that's definitely not acceptable. And there are there are so many examples of that. But again, religion, as with belief in astrology, there are some positive aspects. You go into a beautiful cathedral and you can appreciate the beauty of the place and the artwork, even though you don't believe in God and you don't believe in the supernatural. So, I mean, going back to what we were talking about before, even belief in an afterlife, it can bring people huge comfort. And I wouldn't want to take that comfort away from them. They find comfort in that belief, fine. But if you want to ask me what my honest opinion is on the basis of, my reading of the available evidence, I don't believe that there is such a thing as life after death. Bit of a shame, really. It would have been nice. Or maybe it wouldn't. But I'm not into this whole thing of kind of trying to take other people's beliefs away just because I don't think they're correct. I'd only be interested in doing that or challenging other people's beliefs when they have a negative effect on those around them. Otherwise, you can believe whatever you like.
We are going to get onto the love and horoscope stuff soon after the break, but just to add on to what you said there, we record this just off Oxford Street, and it's quite common to have what I see as Christian Bible preachers as soon as you walk up off the tube. And I've always thought, when I see that, I don't really think much to it. I just kind of walk on to the next. Either I'm going to hell, we're all dying, or whatever it is. But I'm interested because humanists, atheists, they don't necessarily go out preaching on the street as far as I know. But when it comes to respect and the space to have a belief, do you think humanists and atheists get the same kind of respect to practice their belief maybe as other religions? Or do you think we kind of get looked at to the point of where, other religions might always think that we're right and think, another humanist thinking like they know all the answers? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that. If we get the, same amount of respect and space to believe in what we believe in.
I think it very much depends on the particular culture. I mean, I always think of the kind of contrast between the UK and the US. In the UK, people don't really mind if you're an atheist. It's the kind of thing that if you were with a group of people, even if they were religious, and you said, "Oh well, I'm not, I'm an atheist," actually, they're not going to turn on you, and they're not. In America, and certainly in some southern Bible bashing states, if you are an atheist, you keep it very much to yourself because. They would sooner vote a paedophile. Well, they already have, thinking about it, in this president, haven't they? Sorry, that was not a good example. But they would sooner have a paedophile as president than have an atheist as president. They see atheists as being the kind of the lowest of the low, absolutely evil scum. I don't think we're like that at all. I think we're all rather nice. But anyway, I say over here is a very, very different kind of situation. But even here, you still get, people like King Charles talking about being, a representative of all faiths. But Obama managed to mention and those of no faith, and that's really all we're saying is, at least give us equal respect. All of these people with their mutually contradictory religious belief systems, you can respect all of those apparently, and yet often fail to include people who self-classify as having no religion. And we are now the majority in this country, even though people might, sometimes describe themselves as being, I'm C of E without really thinking about it. But actually they're not. They don't believe in God. They don't go to church. They don't do any of the things that a seriously religious person would do. And religious belief is on the decline. There's no question about it.
Not for young people. There's young people that are in rapid amounts of numbers, particularly from my generation, so the lower millennial, Gen Z, finding faith. But as you said, it's interesting to see as economic situations decline, there's not a lot of hope, and there's more, I would say there's always conflict in the world, but right now conflict and difficulty seems to be something increasing more in people's lives. So I don't think that's a coincidence that that's conflated with people taking up more space in religion, younger people especially.
I've got to correct you on this one, Heidi. About 2 days ago, the church retracted that report. Yeah. No, it's all right. No, it's okay. I mean, it's about 2 days ago that YouGov found out that basically they can't trust that data at all. That because of the way that the survey was carried out, it was human error, they say, but a lot of basically they've retracted it. And all the other people at the time thought it was a bit odd because it seemed to go against all of the other measures, all the other surveys that had been done. But there was that claim, that Gen Z in particular was suddenly also going back to church. They're not. They're just not. So, yeah.
I do see it with a few of my friends pick it up a little bit more. So there must have been some kind of little bump or spike. I do believe in that. But, if the data says that, the data says that. But again, can't argue with the data. After the break, we're going to be speaking about how astrology influences our love lives. So I wonder, when you look at, that false report of people running to Christianity, I think is the most prevalent one, or maybe report not to be trusted rather than incorrect report. It makes me think about, what botting accounts are online?
Bots,
Yeah. It makes me think about when a particular group want to disseminate a message online. So if you look at the manosphere, that uses a lot of botting culture. I wonder if the Christian community have a botting culture where they're trying to get more people involved in faith, some kind of QAnon stuff.
Apparently what was happening there is that because of the techniques they'd used to collect the data, they were basically paying people to fill out surveys, but usually they will weed out. There are ways of weeding out whether somebody's taking the survey seriously or not, and that I believe that wasn't done, and so they got people just kind of filling it in as quickly as they possibly could without properly reading questions, and that led to this claim, which I think to be fair to them, I think they then put out in good faith, believing that the survey was carried out by YouGov, and YouGov should know what they're doing. It's YouGov's error, really, not to have done this properly. But the church obviously then leapt on that and said, wow, this is amazing, the young are coming back to the church and so on. And, well, as I say, they've now retracted that whole report. So, and if you look at all the other evidence that's around, traditional religious practices are on the decline, big time, as they have been for decades.
I mean, I could go and talk about this for hours, the selective nature of religion and, using whatever fits your narrative to convey a message, and what does a group of people all believing in the same thing do? It's just an opportunity for people to harvest control and power over people. But we are going to try and keep on the subjects of the podcast. So obviously when I was drafting up my questions, what was always in the back of my mind is people's propensity to relate their romantic lives to horoscopes. It's such an easy thing to do. I actually think when people read their horoscopes, the love life is the section they scan over for the most. And it makes sense, you want to know if someone fancies you, you want to know if heartbreak is on the cards in the future, whatever. In terms of people who really do follow it, I think you can also say there's been a big increase in people looking at astrology. Just yesterday, I was looking on Google Trends and I put astrology, star signs, and something else. And the line from 2004 was vroom. So a massive correlation upwards. But why do people feel so comfortable making important life decisions, or even maybe more mundane life decisions, anchored to horoscopes and star signs when it comes to love and compatibility?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that it's about trying to get some kind of sense of control and understanding in an area of life which is, again, typically for young people, one that's very confusing, and just feeling that you need some kind of guidance. And so, people will often turn to horoscopes for that. Just to make the obvious point, in terms of whether or not there might be anything in it, there absolutely isn't. There's some huge... Not even 1%. There's some huge data sets out there which look at kind of which star signs are supposed to be compatible and which ones are incompatible. And you can look at things like divorce rates. There's nothing. There's no evidence of, there is no actual truth in it.
Is there no even truth or no evidence studies of people looking at the data of people born in September, October, November, December, and seeing if there's characteristics of how those people act if they're born in a certain part of the year?
The only kind of time you see any what could be mistaken for astrological effects, which relate to kind of time of year, not specifically to star sign, but to time of year, is if you think about kids starting at school, if it depending upon when your birthday is, you're starting at that age, and there could be kids that are 25% older than you. Now that's a huge difference developmentally, and not surprisingly, some effects of that can show through, but it's nothing to do with star signs. It's just how old you are when you start school.
That's interesting, because I always think there's something seasonally that can affect people. Not that it's a direct correlation, but we have this thing called seasonal depression, which does. Real. Yep, it is real.
Yeah, no, seasonal affective disorder, with the very appropriate acronym SAD, is a real thing. But again, we don't really need to kind of look to astrology for an explanation there. I mean, during the winter months, it's dark, it's cold. It generally is a bit more miserable. Most people prefer the spring and the summer,
So when people put their love goggles on and they look at the star signs, what they're effectively looking for is some kind of confirmation bias, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the tragedy is here, of course, that people probably sometimes use their belief in astrology to think, oh no, I couldn't go out with that person, even though they think they're really nice, I know that, but look at the star sign, and you might be missing out on potentially a really good relationship there. Yeah. And alternatively, it can work the other way, that if you kind of choose a partner, and particularly when you've got your love goggles on, you tend to overlook any flaws. When people are in love, then they overlook all of the kind of shortcomings that their partner has. In their eyes, they're the most beautiful, wonderful, honest, hardworking, creative, humorous. They're the best person on the planet, And that's nice. But it's usually kind of a little bit down the road, after maybe a year or 18 months, when the effects of the love goggles are beginning to wear off, that you might realise that the relationship is really not all it could be. In extreme situations, in coercive and controlling relationships, you can sometimes get a situation where the partner will continue to believe that this other person who is actually coercively controlling them is not really a bad person. They'll tend to kind of blame themselves for any big arguments that happen, and so on and so forth. And that's an extreme example, but we all tend to do something similar in a milder way when we're in that kind of love goggle type situation. And there is evidence to support the idea that, they've done studies where if you flash up photographs of people who are either strangers or the object of your love, that the brain activity changes, and the parts of the brain that are responsible for, shall we say, critical thinking and rational thought tend to be suppressed when you're looking at pictures of somebody that you are in love with. And as I say, in a sense, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and the idea that kind of when you're in love, you are temporarily a bit crazy, you're a bit mad, but it's also part of the joy of being in love, isn't it?
I think also people mistake when the lust wears off in the relationship, and it gets to the point where you're really deciding, what is this without the lust? People can think that means that the love's gone, but it doesn't mean the love's gone. It just means that you've kind of like got to the next level of your relationship, and it's not built on something as juvenile as lust. But unfortunately, I think it takes people a bit of time to understand that. But you are right, love is something that is so powerful. People have fought wars over people they've been in love with, so it's not an emotion to be played around with. But it's interesting, because another reason why I did want to do this podcast is because my past 2.5 boyfriends, 2.5, interesting. They've all been cancers, and there's a reason why they're all exes. So as a skeptic, I was very curious to know if, I was imagining it, or if I was, if it was just a circumstance or a situation and that's just how it happened. But I guess you must see some patterns and think, well, that is very unusual.
Well, that's a nice example of what I was talking about earlier, the fact that we sometimes think we've seen a meaningful pattern when it's not really there. We are terrible at recognising randomness. There's loads of studies into this. And I mean, we're terrible at appreciating the true nature of coincidence and probability and randomness. Obviously, all these things are essentially saying the same thing, but we will very often be struck by something and think there must be a connection there. There must be a reason for that.
Destiny.
Well, yeah, and no, it probably isn't. Did you actually look at what the personality characteristics of cancers are supposed to be?
I did make them take the Myers-Briggs personality test. That's the first, you're going to think I'm crazy, but the first thing I make someone do if we start going out is take a personality test. But I actually forgot what they were because they're not that important anymore. But they didn't have the same personality, no. They just had the same star sign, and I think my way of making sense of it at the time was saying, oh, they're all cancers, and just trying to make them fit inside of a box, because one thing we know about humans is that they love these little boxes because it helps them understand things, you know, especially as a dyslexic person. I don't like reading a big wall of text, but I like seeing it in sections and boxes so it can help me understand stuff. But I think that's what it was at the time, just a way of trying to make sense of things, you know. Have you ever had any coincidences with star signs yourself, or thought, there's a bit to it?
Not really with star signs, I wouldn't have said. Because again, I don't take astrology seriously at all. I am, having said that, you see, I mean, a lot of people, there are those people who are the hardcore believers who take it very, very seriously. There are probably about 25% of the population, typically, that would come in that category. Varies between genders, as we know. Also, there are those kind of people who would never bother to read the star sign, even if it was the only thing they hadn't read in the newspaper and they were stuck on a desert island, they still wouldn't do it on principle. Whereas a lot of people will read it for fun. You know, you look at what sort of a day am I supposed to be having? Yeah, okay, then maybe. Or, you know, sometimes you think, well, that's just totally out, you know, yeah. But you're reading it for entertainment purposes. But as I say, so you've got to take that into account when you're asking. If you just relied on how many people read their horoscope occasionally, then that would be about 75%. But only a proportion of those are actually taking it seriously. And the other thing, of course, which any astrologers who watch this will be gnashing their teeth and saying that you're talking about star sign astrology and that's not the real thing. You know, the own true astrology, they would say, is you have to have your horoscope cast, and, you know, you have to take into account the position of not quite all the planets, but all the planets that were known then, and the moon and the sun, and, you know, mathematically it is a very complex thing. Before we all had computers, this is something that would take hours and hours and hours to do, and years and years of training to do properly. So it gives the impression of being a science, you know. But it turns out that even those tests of what the astrologers would say is the real thing, versus, you know, it's no better. It still doesn't work. It doesn't make any difference. But I just thought we'd better put that in there to show that we do know that sun sign and star sign astrology is often dismissed by astrologers themselves, even though the same people who are dismissing it often do write the sun sign columns in your magazines and in your newspapers, and they take the check for it.
So when you look at star signs, horoscopes, there's different variations. I think they introduced a new one not that long ago or something like that. That's kind of like a superficial way of engaging with belief. It's a bit of fun. I know some people take it more seriously. And then again, a lot of people use that to influence their love lives, of course, because it's just a fun thing to do. And then you've got kind of like religion, which again is another set of belief, and that's more integrated into society. But then again, I personally believe, as someone who is humanist, kind of used to be agnostic, but probably going maybe more towards atheism, you know, I see some of the outlooks on relationships, dating, how families should be structured, or maybe how women should be more harmful. And that's the part that kind of annoys me. But then again, you look at the structure religion has given people throughout, you know, history in terms of like how to build a family. And some people argue, well, that's a really good way to kind of like anchor in what is life. You know, you usually have two parents. We create children so then we can have a generation to come. And that's kind of just how life goes on, which is true. And then also on top of that, you know, it's the lessons you learn along with these different generations coming through. But the one thing that always really annoys me is that when people think, how can you explain free will if it's not religion or belief or something greater than us? But I always think, is that not silly? Because there's also this physical evolution that goes on, but there's also an emotional evolution that goes on of humans getting better each generation, passing on information to the next generation and all this kind of stuff. And I just think the sickness of what is passed on through religion and like transmitted through the messages is often just so toxic, and that's like where I find a real issue with it. Like horoscopes I can take or leave because it's just a bit of fun, but I'm interested to know, you know, when you see these messages compounded through religion and then it kind of gets this credit of, oh well, it's God and we must all believe in it, how does that, you know, affect you? And like, do you have any personal connection to that? Because you sound quite jovial and away from it, but it must bother you in a personal level sometimes that people are using it as a vehicle to put their own malign ill intent into.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, particularly look at the situation again in America with the Christian far right. You know, I mean, I agree with you, what I suspect is your view, that, you know, a lot of their attitudes and beliefs are totally toxic. I mean, you look at a few kind of famous examples recently of people who seem to have found God, you know, Tommy Robinson and Russell Brand and people like that, and you think, oh, that's convenient, wasn't it? You know, they kind of, yeah, and certainly, you know, a lot of those American preachers were, I mean, there's some famous examples where they were just definite con artists, just out and out con artists. They didn't believe in the religion at all, and yet religion is so easy to sell. They make millions from it, and they end up exploiting, you know, particularly the poor, the sick, the vulnerable, the uneducated. And yeah, I find that absolutely reprehensible. I don't know what you do about it, but I mean, like, you know, a lot of the MAGA movement are people who are coming from that kind of direction. And they're a real threat to the safety of the world, the planet. A lot of them deliberately want, you know, nuclear war in the Middle East because it's the end times coming, isn't it? You know, we have to have that before Jesus comes back to rescue them, not the rest of us. You know, and there's so many kind of aspects of the hypocrisy of all that. You know that. Yeah, only the true believers will be rescued. Sorry, you know, it's not very. It doesn't strike me as very Christian that, well, the rest of you are just going to be, you know, that's end for you guys.
I always think, let's say it just like Armageddon happens, just humour me for a moment, and let's just say like it's in a form of a big wave coming to like wipe out us. If it really is your time and this is like the end times and this is before Jesus comes and there's an option to get on like a plane and go somewhere away from being destroyed by this massive wave that's coming, how would they feel if we just said, okay, well, have fun, we're gonna go, see you, bye? They would run towards the plane. Like, there's a way of just testing people's belief, even with money, you know, like, can you be bought out of your faith? And often the answer is yes. But one thing that I am interested in, because I did a bit of reading around it, is specifically when you look at gender and belief. And I could be wrong, and I'm sure you'll put me on the straight and narrow if I am, but is it true that women are more likely to believe in structures of belief, whether it is horoscopes or religion?
Certainly kind of horoscopes and other paranormal beliefs, yes. I mean, not every study finds a gender difference, but when they do, it's always in that direction. So I think we can pretty safely conclude that women are more likely. I mean, astrology in particular, I think you would find a pretty consistent pattern there. It's women who make more use of astrological services, who are, you know, I mean, and we can see it in the women's magazines, can't we? Astrology is much more prominent. I don't think that magazines like, I don't know, I don't get any men's magazines, but I don't think they have.
Anyone gets magazines anymore?
Not anymore, no. But I mean, they used to, you know, and again, I mean, if you look at kind of, you know, other forms of media, then astrology is taken more seriously in programs aimed at women. And whether that is down to just kind of socialization, I suspect that is the biggest factor. Whether there are any underlying kind of biological differences that might play a role, I think is a bit more debatable. You know, there are differences clearly biologically between men and women. There's hormonal differences. There are some anatomical brain differences. But I mean, the hormonal differences, that's probably going to be quite important, obviously. But I mean, if you look at the anatomical brain differences, they're not really that prominent even in terms of the actual size of the differences, and that doesn't translate immediately into the kind of function of the brain anyway. So it's much more speculative as to whether or not there are kind of readily identifiable differences in terms of how brains are wired up that would push women in one direction and men in another. Whereas the socialization aspects, the idea that women are just brought up to, encouraged to be kind of more in touch with their emotions and to rely more on intuition and so on. That strikes me as being a more likely explanation, but I say we don't know for certain.
I think you're on the money there, because I'm writing a book at the moment, and one thing that I'm getting into is that women are socialized to be more nurturing and more caring, and obviously they kind of pick up men's emotional load over that, and maybe they've taken up too much emotional load from men. So now the men don't have the muscles to kind of handle the emotional load, but women are at maximum capacity and are trained to the gods of having this emotional intuition and just leaps and bounds ahead. But I think the horoscope thing is interesting, because if I was in charge of the world and I was in charge of, I hate using this word because it just, but patriarchy, I would raise girls from young to believe in fairy tales. I would make sure that they believe in horoscopes and make them spend their time believing in fairy tales that aren't realistic but align with the agenda I'm trying to espouse, so they're obedient to it. And it might seem that we're saying something that is very a far-fetch, but I think when you really look at it, it's not a far-fetch. And it's interesting that we can have this conversation from something as juvenile as star signs and horoscopes, just to see how different beliefs are put onto different genders, and actually how that puts us as two different genders who probably want the same thing in terms of to exist peacefully onto different trajectories in life, and how kind of insidious that is.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I've got 4 sisters and no brothers. Wow. I've got 3 daughters and no sons. I've got 2 granddaughters and no grandsons. I know my place, right? So I'm kind of used to having kind of women and girls around. I mean, with our daughters, we tried to do the kind of enlightened thing of, encouraging certainly with our firstborn, buying not only dolls, but also Meccano and all this other stuff. But you still find, because there's so many other influences around, that actually they do want the princess dresses as well, One of my granddaughters in particular, she's very, very into all the kind of Disney stuff. But one thing I did like to see is that, maybe things are changing. I mean, there's K-pop demon hunters. You got strong women there, and she's totally obsessed with K-pop demon hunters. She's very sassy. She's lovely. She's about that big. And, maybe, I think there are signs, I think, that things are changing. It's not, you look back to the kind of, I know it's before your time again, the 1970s, and the kind of roles that you saw for women on TV, with very few exceptions. With Emma Peel in The Avengers, she was a strong woman, but generally women knew their place, and it was usually in the kitchen, or in the bedroom. That's the kind of as far as it went. That's changing, I think, and changing for the better in general. It could all go out of the window, Ken, of course. You look at some of the people, you look at the manosphere, and obviously there's kind of this pushback there, and we need to we need to do something. I don't know what, but we need to try and cope with that because it's such a bad influence. It's such a toxic influence on today's kids.
You must have had a field day watching the Louis Theroux documentary as a psychologist. What was your take on that as a professional?
Well, again, it's not my specific area, so I don't think I can give you any greater insight than a non-psychologist could. Well, I suppose there's a whole kind of irrational belief side to it, and there's a lot of irrational beliefs in the manosphere. I mean, one of the lessons that clearly has come from not just that program, but from the whole, or the commentary on that whole issue, is that there are a lot of young men in particular who feel kind of devalued and worthless and so on. And that's not good. It's not healthy. We don't want them to feel worthless. We don't want young women to feel devalued and worthless. I think, again, I suppose where it does come into my kind of area of expertise is so much of this is in their heads. I mean, it's clear that we still live in a male-dominated society, and yet they don't feel that. They feel it's all women in charge, or it's all this group, it's all this other group who are kind of exploiting them and they've got nothing, And it might not be true, but it's a message that can be exploited by those people that want to exploit it.
I'm no psychologist by any means, but my hot take on it is that it's slightly younger men who feel this. No doubt that there's older men who feel this, but the documentary shows the younger men and in the manosphere. But what they're going through is a stage of grief because we've acknowledged that there needs to be a change, and that's like help from my mum and my grandparents' generation, so first wave feminism. But now that things are starting to change slightly, the cogs are starting to twist in a different way, the world isn't as how their grandfathers or fathers have promised them. They're starting to sweat and realise, oh God, this is not going to be the same for me, and I'm not going to get the same type of privileges, and I'm going to be held to account. So I'm not quite clear on the 5 steps in the correct order, but I think the first one is like denial, and then it's anger. So it feels like we're between the 2 stages.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yeah. I mean, it is a time of huge kind of uncertainty and stress for all young people. It's not just young men by any means. And one of the most kind of reliable results that you can see in the empirical evidence is that it is precisely at those kind of times, those situations, that magical thinking of all kinds flourishes. Whether we're talking about religion, with people going back to more kind of fundamentalist religions, whether we're talking about paranormal beliefs, whether we're talking about beliefs in unfounded conspiracy theories, or whether we're talking about the manosphere, all of those areas, it's this kind of magical thinking that takes over in an attempt to try to make sense of things and to try to get some kind of sense of control. And I mean, particularly when it comes to, say, belief in conspiracies, the evidence would suggest that although people are attracted to those kind of ideas in those kind of circumstances, they don't actually satisfy the psychological needs in the long term. In the short term, you might get something from it, but in the longer term, then they don't really seem to work. So there are no easy answers. I can't tell you what we should do. I wish I could, but we do need to address those issues.
As we wrap this up, and as 2 skeptics sitting in the chairs, if there is someone listening to this or who will see a clip from this and they're feeling a little bit hollow in terms of belief, or maybe they're a skeptic trying to find their way and they don't believe in something because their, atheism doesn't allow them to, or their humanism doesn't allow them to, but they want to feel part of something, but they feel that contradiction. What advice would you give to that person, whether it's they're seeking community, belonging, those products that religion or horoscopes give to you, but they just don't have a fundamental belief in it?
Well, again, particularly with respect to that idea of wanting a sense of community, there are things you can get involved in. I mentioned before, I'm a big supporter of Humanist UK. They hold meetings. There are branches in most cities up and down in the country. For my sins, I run a series of talks called Greenwich Skeptics in the Pub. And there are skeptics in the pub groups up and down the country as well. And there are kind of, for those people who are into science, there's a pint of science, and there's all these other kind of pub meetings, but they're aimed at not academics. They're not technical. They're meant to be engaging speakers talking about interesting stuff, and that's something. I think that kind of sense of community that people get from attending those kind of events is important. You feel like you've found like-minded people that you can sit down with and have a chat with and enjoy being with. So I would definitely recommend that people have a look at that. And of course, there are loads of good books around that people can pick up on, and maybe then go and see some of those people who've written those books giving talks in the pubs. I'm a great believer in talks in pubs myself, so it's one of the best places to do talks. But yeah, there is a community out there. You just I'm not a great fan of kind of tribalism, because that's what we've been talking about quite a lot, one way or another. But if your tribe is actually other kind of fellow humanists, atheists, skeptics, well, there are groups out there that you can get involved with, and hopefully you get something positive from that.
Dr. Chris French, thank you very much.